So South Korea is looking to find a balance in handling North Korean issues, especially with China and Russia's relationship with the regime. For more, we are joined by Professor Lee Hee-eun this morning. Welcome to the program.
Hey, good morning, and thank you for having me.
Sure. Now, first off, how significant do you think the sit-down was between President Yoon Suk Yeol and Chinese Premier Li Qiang? I mean, how do you think the talks actually went?
I think it was very significant because this is the first time the meeting has happened at this level in 10 months since the last time President Xi met with President Yoon. So given the circumstances, since President Yoon has met with Japan and the United States, having a meeting with China at this level, of course, is very significant because Korea's interest is to engage China very actively. And so since Korea has been drawing closer to Japan and the United States, it's really important for Korea to have these sort of high-level meetings to engage in dialogue with China, because China, of course, is going to have a major influence in what happens in the region.
Right, and at the same time, President Yoon Suk Yeol couldn't stress enough how North Korea issues should not get in the way of Seoul-Beijing relations. Do you think, Professor, China took the message well?
I think China's interest naturally is to make sure that the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula happens. But I think the difficulty here, of course, is China's interest mainly is to make sure that the North Korean regime is stable. North Korea obviously serves as a buffer against other interests in the region for China. And so this issue is complicated because China, I think, has a priority not necessarily to deal with denuclearization per se, but again, to make sure that the Kim Jong-un regime survives. And so in this context, while nuclear weapons on the peninsula certainly is a destabilizing effect, because obviously this may lead to a greater pressure on the North Korean regime from Japan, South Korea, and the United States, China, I think, has a complicated role here with respect to North Korea. And so it's unclear at this point whether or not China will play a really active role in this denuclearization process.
Right, that's why President Yoon Suk Yeol also said North Korea's nuclear and missile development poses an existential threat that can strike all participating nations at the East Asia Summit yesterday. Now, what's behind such a strong statement from President Yoon this time?
I think he wants to be sure that he garners enough international support in terms of dealing with this issue. So obviously in this context, this happens sort of at a global level. And so in this context, this is the real issue here, is drawing in more international support for making sure that as well as solidify the global community's efforts to deal with North Korea on these different fronts.
Right. So I just asked how North Korea's nuclear and missile development can pose a great threat to all participating nations at the East Asia Summit. And that is because President Yoon is trying to garner all the international support, especially how the nuclear and missile threats are ever growing.
Absolutely. This is a real big problem for the region. So this is obviously one thing that Korea wants to make sure that obviously this is an issue that the global community is standing behind South Korea on a unified front against these kinds of threats to international peace and security.
Right, but at the same time, regarding tensions in the South China Sea, let's say, President Yoon said any unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force will not be tolerated. A comment apparently targeting China. Now, that stance is no surprise, right?
Yes, because Korea has a great interest in making sure that the South China Sea is stable. Korea obviously depends on international trade for exports as well as importing raw materials as well as other things. And so if the South China Sea is unstable and China dominates that area, that puts Korea in a very difficult position with respect to its economic growth. And so because of this, complicated matter with respect to the South China Sea, Korea has a great interest in making sure it's stable and it's open for navigation. And so in this context, Korea has a great interest in making sure the maritime order is stable and therefore is calling for a maritime-based order in the region as opposed to one nation, namely China, dominating the whole ocean there.
Right. I know the member states there had a collective voice on North Korean issues and also, food security. But how come the leaders at the EAS yesterday failed to draw a joint statement on the Ukraine crisis then?
Yeah, because the EAS summit was basically included both China and Russia. So in order to have a joint statement, you have to have consensus among all the members. So here, because there was never going to be any consensus on the matter, the best that happened here with respect to Ukraine was a chairman's statement by Joko Wi. And so the chairman's statement reiterated the position that the aggression in Ukraine was against international law and demanded the withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine. But as far as the joint statement was concerned, there was no expectation here because China and Russia were going to be needed to be supportive of such a statement.
Right. In fact, that was no surprise. All right. Thank you, Professor Lee Hee-eun, so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for having me.